Hello everyone and welcome to my Magicka Necromancer guide for the Stonethorn patch. Sorry it took so long, but let's jump right into it and let's get started. So, to go over, the first thing is the race. I chose to go with High Elf because it does give you the highest damage possible for Necromancer. However, the next best would be Dark Elf, following that would be Khajiit, and if you're having real big sustain issues or you're at low CP, I do recommend going Breton for the sustain and the survivability. For the Mundus, we're always using the Shadow Mundus, simply because it does give you the most damage and because of the passives for Necromancer giving him a lot of crit and crit damage. Next, for our food, we're going to be using the Allure, otherwise known as the Artaeum Pickled Fish Bowl. Second option would be, again, Clockwork Citrus Filet if you're going with High Elf and you're still having trouble sustaining. Instead of race changing to Breton, you can simply put on this recovery food. Because of the Necro passives, you'll still have a lot of HP, so you'll be safe, and you'll have a little bit more Magicka recovery. Last food that we do use is the Ghastly Eye Bowl, and this is purely for your practicing and testing your damage on dummy. You will never be able to use this in raid scenarios because you simply will have no HP. You'll always be dead on the floor. For the potions, we're going to be using our spell power potions. However, because the necromancers are required to sometimes wear MA, which you want to make sure that you're building a lot of ult, sometimes you'll be using the minor heroism potions. The way you make that is with Dragon Rheum, Dragon Blood, and Columbine. And that's going to give you Magicka, stamina, and minor heroism, giving you a lot of ultimate very, very quickly. For the champion points. Now, there are a lot of different scenarios, so this is completely up to you, but this is what me and some of the best necromancers that are playing in our group in Rizzolan and Cabs have been using for a long time, and they're doing the most damage on necromancers I've ever seen, so I would highly trust this key that they're using. So for the blue tree, we have 61 Elfborn, 56 Elemental Expert, only one Spell Erosion because you can't reach any other jump points with this. However, you don't need any points into Spell Erosion because of the Necromancer and passives. We have 16 into Staff Expert, 61 into Master at Arms, 72 Thaumaturge, just because 72 is a jump point, and 3 Piercing just for a little bit of extra damage, but this really doesn't matter. You do want the 75 points into the last blue tree for the Exploiter passive, which increases your damage done against off-balance enemies by 10%. In an organized group, you're going to have off-balance uptimes, they're going to be pretty high, so this is going to give you a lot of damage to the Necromancer. For the red, again, this is completely based on what you prefer and based on the trial. However, this is a really nice balanced CP that you can always use and be safe with. So you're going to have 66 Ironclad, 22 Spell Shield, 48 Thick Skinned, 27 Hardy, 75 Elemental Defender. For more poison-based, physical damage-based trials, you can take points out of here and put them into here, even them out, whatever you want to do. Lastly, we have 32 points in a quick recovery, so you can get a little bit more healing. For the blue tree, I chose to go with 28 Warlord, 5 Bashing Focus, 9 Sprinter, 100 into Arcanist, 49 into Tenacity. The sustain on Necromancers can be rough sometimes, so you do have to sometimes use 1 or 2 heavy attacks. And lastly, Mooncalf to increase your stamina recovery because a lot of the Magicka Necromancers are going to be using Martial Knowledge as a debuff set in your group, so that's going to help you a little bit with the stam sustain and making sure that you don't run into trouble with your stamina. Lastly, we have 28 points into Tumbling and 28 points into Shadow Ward. That's it for the CP. Now, there are a ton of options as far as skills and gear goes. I'm not going to go over each and every one of them in detail. We'll go over each one, and then I'll leave all of these specific setups in the description below so you can check it out slowly, take your time, and make sure you can get the clean setups ready for yourself. So the first line is all about Elemental Catalyst. Now, Elemental Catalyst can be used with Sorrow, Medusa, Sororia, and False Gods, and I'll tell you which is good for which. So if you do need a little bit of space on your bar, or if you have one healer or your combo pair is not looking great, I always highly recommend going Medusa because that gives you space to take off Barb Trap or Channeled Acceleration and use Camo Hunter instead. But every single gear setup is going to have the same traits, same setup, so let's take a look at that. On the front bar, if you're using Elemental Catalyst, I highly recommend 2 things. Number 1, try to farm that Inferno Staff, and number 2, your skills are going to be a little bit different because we're going to be using Force Pulse on our front bar instead of usually using Ricochet Skull, simply because the way that Elemental Catalyst works is, whenever you deal Flame Shock or Frost damage, you apply a stack of Flame Shock or Frost Weakness to the enemy for 3 seconds. Each stack of Elemental Weakness increases their critical damage taken by 3%. So if you can keep this up, which Forcefuls does very, very, very well, the enemy that you're debuffing is always going to take 9% more critical damage. That's really, really huge. Imagine every single person in your group doing 9% more critical damage. It's an incredible DPS increase. That is why the Catalyst set is a must-have. And the reason why Necro keeps it up so well is for 3 reasons. Number 1, they have Boneyard, which does frost damage. Number 2, they have Unstable Wall of Fire, which does flame damage. Number 3, Mystic Siphon, which does shock damage. So you always have shock, flame, and frost up at all times, as well as now you adding Force Pulse to your rotation, which always makes sure that all of those debuffs are kept up. So that's really, really nice. And that is why the Necromancer is the best class to use this debuff set on. So let's take a look at the gear and the traits. So for the gear, our front bar staff is always going to be precise, and it's always going to have a flame damage glyph. Our jewelry is always going to be bloodthirsty. Is by far the best trait in any trial, any scenario, especially for the Necromancer, because they do get increased damage and execute due to their passives. All of our gear is going to be divines, max mag glyphs, of course, and then you're always going to want to shoot for medium, heavy, and 5 light. So you're always going to want to have the 5-1-1. On the back bar staff, you're going to use an infused Inferno staff. Again, you don't need a perfected version. It doesn't really increase your DPS. You already have enough pen, so that pen bonus is a waste. However, I did farm an Inferno staff that's perfected, so I'm using that. For the fights that are non-Daedric, so pretty much everywhere where there are no vampires or Daedra, you're always going to be using the glyph that increases your weapon and spell damage, the Berserk glyph. However, during fights where you are fighting Daedra or vampires, you always switch your Inferno staff to the Daedric enchant, which is going to give you a shit ton of damage to Undead and Daedra. So I do recommend for those fights use this, otherwise just use your regular Berserker glyph. So all of these traits that we just discussed are going to be used in every single setup that we have here, so you never have to wonder about what enchants, what glyphs, what traits to use. They're always going to be the same. Nothing is ever going to change. Now let's talk about the skills. So when you're not wearing Medusa and you are wearing Catalyst, again, we went over having Force Pulse. Now you need 3 different Grave Lord abilities on your front bar. So we do place the Colossus on our front bar for this setup because we're using Force Pulse instead of Ricochet Skull. However, when you do use Ricochet Skull, these are our 3 Grave Lord abilities, so you don't need to have Colossus front bar. You can simply back bar it, and that will be enough for you to get 100% crit and execute. So Force Pulse with Elemental Catalyst, that is our main spammable. Stalking Blast ones, you want to try to keep this up every 2 to 3 abilities. It does a lot of damage. It's also AoE. It also leaves corpses, so you can use Mystic Siphon with that. Then we're going to have Mystic Orb. Now, when you are dummy humping, you cannot sustain Mystic Orb, so you can switch this for Degeneration, the other morph of Structured Entropy. However, in trials, every single trial that you do, Mystic Orb is one of our highest damaging abilities, so make sure you're always using this. Mystic Siphon, this can be a buggy skill, however, it's very necessary, it does a lot of damage, and it also really, really helps you with your sustain, so you want to try to keep this up as much as possible. Inner Light on our front bar, just for the increased max mag, and you need to have Major Prophecy when you are using the Heroism pods, which you're going to be using a lot if you're pushing score or pushing trials. Last but not least, again, this is our 3rd Gravelord ability, and this is one of the main reasons why Necromancers are so good. Technically speaking, Necros give the most damage to the group because simply of major vulnerability that gives 30% damage to your whole group for 8 seconds, which is absolutely insane. On the back bar, we're going to be using our Skeletal Arcanist, Unnerving Boneyard, Unstable Wall of Fire, Bar Trap, or Channeled Acceleration, whichever. If the fight is mobile and you can't go melee, use Channeled Acceleration. If the fight is stationary, you can go melee. Bar Trap is definitely the way to go. It'll help you with your sustain, and it does do a little bit of extra damage. Inner Light is our flex spot, so if you're using Heroism pots and you don't need like a shield or extra healing, you definitely use Inner Light on the back bar, so you have Major Prophecy on both bars. However, if you do need a shield, you can always switch this out for that. Or if you just need a little bit of extra healing, for example, in Asylum, it's a really nice thing to have. Use Spirit Guardian. Another really nice option when you have a lot of downtime with trash during boss fights, for example, like Sunspire, you can put on Necrotic Potency in this position and have that available to you as well. Colossus on our back bar. And that's pretty much it for the Catalyst setups. Now, all the other setups, our bars are going to be a little bit different. So our front bar would be Ricochet Skull instead of Force Pulse. Slot Meteor for a little bit of extra Magicka. You'll still always be using Colossus, however. Now let's talk about the next debuff set that Necros use this patch a lot, being Martial Knowledge. Now, I do recommend double barring Martial Knowledge, so I do have it set up on both bars. However, the only time that you're going to have Martial Knowledge front barred only is when you do use Medusa. When we are using Medusa, you want to make sure that both your pieces are light. So you have 5 light, 2 heavy, just because Medusa is a heavy armor set. So you're going to have Medusa on chest and legs for the maximum armor. You're going to have it on jewelry, so that forces you to put Martial Knowledge on your front bar only. However, again, the skills stay the same. You are gaining that 1 extra slot, so this becomes your extra slot that you can use. You can still put Orb on your front bar and slot, for example, all of the things that we discussed earlier. So it could be Potency, Shield, Ghost, whatever it is that you want to slot instead of that. And MK is nicely paired with Sorrow, Medusa, Auroria for the most damage possible. And if you're still having trouble sustaining, False Gods is just as good. All of these setups are going to give you nice damage. It really depends on how you're playing. The last buff slash debuff set that we do use on Necromancers this patch is Master Architect. Now, Master Architect is nice in places where, for example, a healer cannot run Jorvolds and Roaring, and places such as Asylum Sanctorium. So in Asylum, you're going to want to have 3 people with Master Architect or War Machine to give people Major Slayer, because Roaring simply doesn't work very well and you don't have enough sets available to you. So the Necros do run Master Architect in Asylum. The Master Architect setups work pretty much the same as any other buff or debuff set. You're going to want to pair them with Sorrow, Medusa, Elemental Catalyst, for example, in Asylum, or MK if you're a complete buff and debuff bitch in any of the trials. Last but not least, our full damage setup. So our full damage setup that's going to give you the most damage is Sorrow Sororia. However, Sorrow False Gods in any mobile fights where you can't stand stationary. Medusa Sororia if you want to get the most damage possible and you don't have the ability to go melee and place trap or whatever, or you don't want to waste time and it's a long fight where you have to constantly do damage. And then lastly, Medusa Fallen Gods for any mobile, non-stationary fights where you do need a lot of sustain as well. Let's go over the trash setups. So for the trash, it almost looks exactly like our single target setups. Now a lot of people think, oh, why do you not have any AoE ability slotted? Force Pulse is actually a really strong AoE ability. The Force Pulse bounce does a ton of damage. So as long as you're keeping up Blast Bones, keeping up all your AoE dots and just spamming Force Pulse, it's very strong. Of course, you want to try to use Necrotic Potency after all the waves are dead and then move on to the next trash wave. So Sorrow, False Gods is a really nice setup. The second setup that I use is Medusa, False Gods, Grotdar. That's again where you have constant wave spawning, you don't have time to cast Channeled, or you simply want to just continue to stay in the fight and do damage. This is also a really nice setup. Both of the setups are going to give you pretty much the same damage. Next is False Gods Acuity. Now, this is going to give you the best results when there is a short, bursty waves of ads. So for example, one wave then it ends, you run to the next wave. One wave, it ends, you run to the next wave. If you have wave after wave after wave, don't use Acuity, use the other two setups. And last but not least, you can get away with having only 2 Necromancers using Colossus and the third one just going full damage, or being a tank or support using Warhorn, if you wear Deadwater's Guile. And the way that this set works is, when an enemy dies within 2 seconds of being damaged by you, you gain 15 ultimate. This gives you a ton of ultimate, and because this gives you a ton of ultimate, we changed from Grothar to Balorgs. We're still using False Gods because it's a really nice sustain set, and it still gives you a ton of damage. However, Deadwater's Guile allows only 2 Necromancers to have the Colossus, so leaving a third one with either damage ult or Warhorn if you do have a support Necromancer. I highly recommend everybody tries this. This is a really strong setup. You do lose a little bit of damage, but you being able to ult over and over and over does make up for it. Lastly, for the gear, we have quite a few different pre-buff setups that we're using this patch, which really speed up the fights, and let's go over them quickly. The first setup is Moondancer and Jorvolts. So if a fight lasts 45 seconds, you simply precast Channeled Acceleration right before the fight starts, switch to your boss gear, and you're good to go. Now you have Minor Force for 50 seconds. So if the fight lasts 45 to 50 seconds, you don't even need to cast Trap. You can just slot another damage ability such as Mage's Guild Rune here, and not having to worry about Force at all. The second really nice pre-buff set is Balorg, Arcasis, and Elfbane. So if you already have a fight that lasts only about 40 seconds, and you only need to use 2 Colossus, one of the Necromancers can pre-buff with Destro, and have a nice burst in the beginning. The next one is Elfbane, Amay, and Balorg. So you can also use Jorvolts, Amay, and Balorgs, and Destro, and that's going to give your whole team about 50 seconds of Major Slayer, which is really strong. And last but not least, we're using Speed Gear. For the Speed Gear, we're using the Ring of the Wild Hunt, of course, Howard's Gear to keep up Major Expedition, and Fjords to give you a little bit of speed. Your speed is capped with this. You don't even have to sprint. You can just run. So that's it for all the gear and the skills. Let's take a look at the actual rotation. So we're going to use the Elemental Catalyst setup for the rotation, and let's go over the priority of the dots. So the first things first, when you're entering a fight, you want to make sure that your Archer is cast. As you're running in, Blast Bones, and place Trap. Let me just turn off high group so you can see my pets. So the dot prioritization works like this. You always want to make sure that your Blockade is up first, then your Boneyard, and your Blast Bones is always active. Then Orb is next, Mystic Siphon is next, and again Blast Bones. And then 2 Force Pulses, and Blast Bones. Now sometimes when you can't go completely melee in the fight, your Blast Bones do bug out a little bit, so what I recommend is you use a bit of an adjusted rotation, so it would work like this. You come into the fight, Archer, Trap, Blast Bones. Now you do Wall, Boneyard, Blast Bones, Orb, Spammable, Mystic Siphon, Blast Bones, and then 2 more Spammables, and Blast Bones. And you rinse and repeat. Anytime your Arch runs out, just cast it right away. And that is the simplified, easy to use rotation. Now again, sometimes you're not going to be in melee range all the time, so sometimes you'll have to use 3 abilities before Blast Bones. So it would be a Blast Bones, 3 abilities, Blast Bones, 3 abilities, Blast Bones. The only thing that you want to make sure that you use so your Mystic Siphon doesn't bug out is use Mystic Siphon as your 3rd ability after using Blast Bones. So again, my full rotation would look like this. Now, that's the rotation until execute. Now, execute works like this. So anytime your dots are not going to last the whole duration of the boss being alive, that means they're not worth recasting. So for example, if the boss is going to die in 3 or 4 seconds, it is not worth it for me to replace all my dots and blast bones. What I do is, once the boss is about to die, I simply replace my blockade, maybe use blast bones, and then just Spammable the rest of the way, and then it's going to die a few seconds later. Otherwise, your execute rotation doesn't change. You're keeping up your dots as long as they're going to be able to last their full duration, and just use the regular Spammable, regular rotation as you would all the time. So that's pretty much it for the whole guide. You've learned about the rotation, you've learned about the class, you've learned about the abilities, the skills, all the gear that we use. If you have any questions, make sure you leave them in the comment section below. I love answering questions as much as I possibly can. Again, all of this info is going to be in the description. I hope this helped you out. If you have any questions, again, please let us know. And thank you for watching, and have a great day. Bye.